Welcome to Reddit Aliens. Cops of Reddit. What is the strangest call you've ever had to respond to? What happened? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Do paramedics count? I responded to a call from a father who needed help applying medicinal cream to his 13-year-old daughter's vagina to heal her STD. He said he tried to do it himself, but it was swollen shut. I just brought her to the hospital. Ugh. 911 dispatcher reporting in. Received a call from an elderly lady who had trouble breathing. I had taken several calls from her and her husband in the past, so I recognized her voice. I dispatched an ambulance to her residence and held her on the line, trying to keep her calm while the ambulance was responding. Ambulance advised that they are 15 minutes ETA. She lived in a very rural part of West Virginia. I'm talking to her, asking about her husband and how he was doing, and just making small talk with her. The ambulance calls in and advises they are on scene, and I let them know that she is in severe respiratory distress, and I still had her on the line. I let her know the ambulance is coming to the door to go answer the door, and she says okay, and hangs up on the phone. Pretty normal, yeah? Well, here's where it gets weird. The EMT and paramedic on scene call back about a minute later and advise no one is answering the door. We have a sheriff unit who was in the area pulling on scene about that time. The sheriff unit confirmed the address and advised he is breaching the door to make access to the PT. 5 minutes go by, and paramedic on scene radios in asking who the caller was. I advise it was the elderly female who lived at the residence. He tells me that he's going to call in and needs to speak with the supervisor on shift. We get him over to the supervisor, and the supervisor confirms the information that I gave him and asks what's going on. Apparently, the elderly female had been dead for a while and was in already full rigor mortis. They thought I was wrong on the caller, but the other dispatchers played it back and confirmed that it was the female who called. The ambulance transferred the hospital, and we got the same calls and disbelief from the doctors. So I took a call from a ghost? Taking this person at their word, this would be an awesome short story, or maybe even like a little horror anthology. Cool. I'm interning with a sheriff's police department, so most of my time is spent on patrol. We got called out to do a wellness check, which the deputy thought was going to be a piece of cake, like she was out of town or something. We got there and are met by the neighbors, who told us that the mail is piling up in the mailbox and that there are several unnoticed packages on the porch. Okay, so we go up to the house and the front door is unsecured. So we crack open the door a couple of inches and deputy calls inside, but the door won't move anymore. The house was one of those split houses where the stairs meet at the front door and the upstairs and downstairs are offset, so we concluded that there might be stuff behind the door. It's about this time that the deputy tells me that she is a known hoarder, and that could be why the door was stuck. He also mentions that if we see flies on the inside of the windows, she's most likely inside and deceased. As we walk around the side of the house, we notice a lot of flies on the windows. The back door was locked, and as we looked in, we noticed bags on bags of garbage, diapers, and miscellaneous shit all over the place. We head back to the front and attempt to make entry. He pushes the door open, this time with more force, and from underneath, I see a grease-like liquid spreading out from under the door. The deputy stops, closes the door, and calmly tells me that the lady was indeed dead and wedged behind the door. From the dates of the packages, we concluded that she had gone about 2 months. Once we did make entry into the house, I was allowed inside. After 2 months, she didn't even look like a human corpse. Her skin and body had sagged and melted to the floor, and her face was all black and had been eaten to the bone by maggots. I'll never forget the smell when the coroners moved her and she popped. It was like a physical presence. Whatever those people get paid to deal with that shit is not enough. The thing that really got to me though was wondering if she had fallen down the stairs and died there, or if she fell and wasn't able to move and waited for help that would never come. Went to do a welfare check. A neighbor called in. He hasn't seen this guy for a few days and the lights have been on for a while. I go and look around and find no footprints or tire marks in the snow, recent storm. I checked the garage and nothing. I checked the house, which was locked, and found the guy's cell phone, keys, wallet, and cash with the TV on. That's when I realized this was now a dead body search. I looked everywhere, in and outside the house and around the garage. There were several old junk vehicles on the property, but again, no tire marks or shoe prints or anything. I call all recent numbers on his phone, and no one's heard from him. Only so much I can do, so I issue a BOL and we start getting NCIC paperwork ready. Next day, the day shift officer goes over to follow up. Turns out, the guy was plowing his driveway and either had a medical condition or something and either passed out or died on the spot and crashed the truck onto the other junk cars, which then caught on fire. Edit. Investigation led to the fact this happens a week before I got this call, leaving only a pile of bones in the front seat covered in snow. I felt like shit for not finding him that night, but it was really creepy knowing his remains were inches away from where I was searching. I'm not a cop, but my dad just recently shared these stories with me. My grandfather was a cop in a small town in the 60s and 70s. Late at night, it was common for officers to pull over vehicles driving through town, especially if they didn't recognize them. He pulls over a busload of people. He walks through and asks them where they're headed, yada yada. They were headed to California. It was Charles Manson and his group. I stopped a 25-year-old Asian male from entering the east executive entrance of the White House. He had slit his wrists and neck prior to his arrival, but not deep enough to hit major blood vessels. He told me that he was a secret agent working for J. Edgar Hoover and that he was 60 years old. He said he had important information to pass to President Obama. I ended up having to detain him, stop the bleeding, and then involuntarily commit him. Turned out to be a local college kid going through some mental health issues. I field interviewed hundreds of White House callers, but this kid took the cake. Got a report of a missing husband. He told his wife and family of 6 children that he was going to get his tires changed but never returned, and this was 12 hours ago. They had purchased another house in a neighboring community and the relationship with the wife was under pressure, so the wife assumed he was staying at the other house and claimed he would never kill himself. The strange thing about this report, though, was that he emptied his personal bank account into his wife's the morning as well. The wife explained this off, saying that they recently had a fight about finances and he agreed that he was bad at money and maybe they should just have a joint bank account that she controls. On a hunch, I asked his 14-year-old boy if there were any areas in the mountains nearby that his father enjoyed going, and the son identified a road about 10 miles away. It was nearing midnight, and I decided to drive to the top of this old and abandoned Forest Service road. As I drove through the snow and started to climb the road, I felt a gut feeling that I would 100% find this guy up there, either thinking about or already acted out a suicide. The snow-laid gravel road had some signs of travel, but no real indication of how fresh the vehicle tracks could be. As I reached the top of the road, after an hour of travel, I was honestly surprised that I did not find his black truck. I spent the drive back down thinking about gut feelings and how they are unreliable, but that I somehow felt different about this one. As I traveled up the road, I did notice over a dozen smaller roads branching off, but they were not mapped, and I had already spent too much time on a single occurrence in a busy city with too few police officers. Nonetheless, I decided to check a single of these secondary roads, and about 3/4 of the way down, I picked a road at a random to check, and sure enough, my headlights lit up the back end of a black truck about 100 yards past the first corner. Even if I hadn't memorized the license plate beforehand, I wouldn't have had to run it. It was clearly his. I radioed that I had found the truck, parked my vehicle, and traveled the 20 feet to his truck, with my heart beating like I was doing a sprint rather than a normal walk. What I found inside was a mess of brains and blood caused by a self-inflicted shotgun wound under the chin. I'll save you from the description. There was just something about that gut feeling when traveling the abandoned and quiet mountain road, followed by a sense of being tricked by the gut feeling, then finding out it was true by discovering such a gruesome scene, having to wait 3 hours next to his truck waiting for body removal, and then to end it all by having to go to the family who was expecting good news to deliver to them the worst possible news. That makes me feel creeped out to this day. I responded to a report of an unresponsive infant. When I arrived, all the family members were standing around casually in the front yard pointing into the house. I found the baby in the back room laying on her back on a bare mattress. I started CPR but realized the baby was probably already deceased. We rushed her out to the arriving ambulance hoping they had a way to bring her back. I learned she was the mother's second suspicious SIDS death, and I had her other children removed from her care. The difficult part was when I left the scene and went to the ER to see what came of the situation. As I walked in and asked where she was, an ER nurse walked me over and handed me the deceased baby swaddled in a blanket and told me to wait for someone to show me to the morgue. So I'm standing there in the ER, in uniform, holding what everyone thinks is a live infant, but rather an infant corpse. And several people stop by wanting to see her and commenting on how cute it is to see an officer holding a baby. I just smiled, but it killed me inside. I was ushered back to the morgue after what felt like an eternity and told I had to wait with the baby until the medical examiner arrived. They took the blankets off and laid her on a stainless steel gurney and left me alone with her again. I lounged around the morgue for about an hour waiting. By the time I got home several hours after the end of my shift, because this call came out 15 minutes before the end of my 10-hour shift, I lay down on my bed and cried for a long time. My young daughter was in daycare and my wife at work. I really needed to hold both of them, so the house felt incredibly empty. My daughter was only slightly older than the infant, and when I was looking at her earlier, I kept seeing my own daughter. I didn't get any sleep at all before going back in for the next shift later that night. This was one of the hardest stories I had to read all week. As a parent myself, it's impossible not to put yourself in the shoes of that person, and I'm sorry for everyone involved. That's a rough one. One night at about 11:30, this guy jumps off a bridge into a bay. On the way down, he hits a guardrail and loses both forearms and the top of his head. A set of officers found his arms and set them aside. I was on the dive team, so we got to collect his remains. While we checked on his condition, we noticed the brain is missing. This was me flipping up his scalp and taking a peek inside to find nothing there. It's very strange to look for something very important and not to find it. Anyway, we bag him up and get him on the boat. Our supervisor tells us we have to at least look for his brains. Gross. So we dive and look around, but the only thing we find is a piece of a skull. And we had decided if we did find it, none of us wanted to grab it. 2 adults reported missing, parents of 2 adult children, 1 male, 1 female. Alerts are in place for the missing people's credit cards. The father's credit card hits on a purchase at a jewelry store where an engagement ring was purchased. It leads us to the son who made the purchase of the ring. Son is questioned and confessed to killing both parents and burying them in shallow graves. The son led us to the gravesite, and when we began the process of recovery, both mom and dad had black garbage bags over their heads, being held in place by duct tape around their necks. The sight of the bodies, especially their faces, once the bags were removed, and the smell is something I'll never forget. My father has been an officer for 20 plus years, and this story is probably the worst thing he has ever had to do. My father and I were heading to the range one day to sight in our hunting rifles. We were in his police vehicle since we were going to the shooting range for local law enforcement personnel. Dispatch came over the radio to get an officer out to a 911 call of a possible dead body. Many of his officers joked over the radio that it was probably a prank or someone overreacting since it was around Halloween. The responding officer arrives at the scene and calls in that he's going into the woods to investigate. A few minutes later, he sends out a call confirming it's an actual dead body and to get the necessary resources sent out to assist. Then the responding officer personally calls my father because he recognized the body. It was my dad's brother. He had been having rough times and decided to end it by hanging himself from a tree 50 yards into the woods next to railroad tracks. The second worst part was that he had been reported missing for a few months. So by the time they found his body, he was severely rotted. The worst part was that my father had to go assist in the removal and scene investigation. That day was the first time I ever saw my father cry, and I was in my mid-teens. My department sends an officer to all rescue calls if one is available. We got a call late one night to assist rescue at a townhouse complex for a woman hemorrhaging. We didn't show up until rescue had already left with the patient, so we let ourselves into the residence and eventually found the bathroom, which was covered in blood. Blood on the walls, all over the toilet, everywhere. Crazy amount of blood. Rescue hadn't mentioned anything suspicious on the radio, so this was surprising. We were preparing to leave when one of the younger officers noticed bloody footprints leading to the front door, and then across the parking lot to a dumpster. We gathered at the dumpster, lifted up the top, and lit up the interior with our flashlights. Same officer extended his baton, reached into the dumpster with it, and brought out a bloody plastic grocery bag with a dead baby in it. True story. I'm not sure if this is a federal law or just in New York State, but mothers can take newborn babies and leave them at firehouses and they'll be cared for. I wish there was a way to inform the public because this should never, ever happen. My cousin is a cop, and he responded to a call on Valentine's Day night. A 12-year-old girl called in to say her mother had blown her brains out in the living room. I guess her and her brother were getting ready for dinner, and the mom just shot herself. He said the creepy thing about it was the dinner was all set up, drinks on the table, and suddenly she shot herself. Kids were sitting outside when he arrived. To this day, I can't imagine Valentine's Day for them, but I know that is something that stuck with him, seeing that. I'm not sure if this is a federal law or just in New York State, but mothers can take newborn babies and leave them at firehouses and they'll be cared for. I wish there was a way to inform the public because this should never, ever happen. Detention officer at a local jail here. We had a guy get brought in about 2 a.m. one night who we immediately knew was about to give us a fun time based on the way he was moving, quickly snapping the head back and forth, looking all over the room, etc. One of my coworkers and I stay with the booking officer to help her out when the shit inevitably hits the fan. The guy keeps rambling on throughout the whole process. Parts of his speech are understandable, but most of it is gibberish. At one point, he looks up at my coworker and says, "Would you blame me for it?" Trying to keep the guy calm, my coworker tells him, "Nah, man, no one can blame you." For whatever reason, this set the guy off. He leaps off the bench, and we both push him back down. My coworker is trying to get handcuffs on his other wrist. He was already handcuffed by one hand to the bench, and I'm holding him against the wall with every bit of strength I have. This MFer was strong. I swear the bench was about to come off of the concrete when he first leapt at us. Once my coworker gets handcuffs on him, we take a step back. The guy throws his head back, eyes rolled all the way back, and lets out an inhuman scream that I've only heard in movies about demon possession. He then moves his head as if he's looking around the room, but still with his eyes rolled into the back of his head, and spouts off more nonsense. I'm not Catholic, but I was very tempted to cross myself. The screaming, head throwing back and eye rolling continue on for about 45 minutes. Every so often he'd come back to reality and talk to us like a normal person for a moment, and then go back into crazy mode.